In the bustling city where power and ambition collided, Sarah Kent had built a name for herself as one of the most fearless journalists in the business. Working for a prominent newspaper, she had an uncanny ability to dig deep and uncover the hidden truths that others feared to touch. Her sharp intuition had led her to investigate everything from government corruption to corporate fraud. Yet despite her rising success, Sarah harbored a secret, one that, if revealed, could destroy her career and tarnish her hard-earned reputation. State Senator Thomas Miller, on the other hand, had long been the face of the city's political elite. A polished figure with a carefully crafted public image, he was a man of charm, power, and influence. People loved him for his speeches on reform and change, believing him to be a politician who was genuinely invested in the welfare of the people. But behind the scenes, Miller had his hands in murky dealings, connecting with powerful businessmen who didn't play by the rules. While he made his career based on promises of integrity, his actions told a different story. It was no surprise that Sarah and Thomas first crossed paths at a high-profitable charity event, where the city's most influential individuals gathered to discuss their latest philanthropic projects. Sarah had been sent to cover the event, but her sharp eyes immediately caught something more than the polished conversations around her. As she navigated the crowd, she found herself drawn to Miller, specifically to his ability to charm everyone in the room with an ease that was almost too perfect. There was something about him that didn't sit right. He was too composed, too smooth. But he wasn't the only one noticing Sarah. He approached her with the kind of calculated politeness that only a politician could pull off. They exchanged pleasantries at first, but as the evening wore on, their conversation turned into something more personal. Miller was intrigued by Sarah's sharp intellect and her fearless approach to journalism. And Sarah, though initially cautious, found herself captivated by his charisma. They spoke about politics, ambition, and the state of the country. But it wasn't long before their conversation slipped into more private territory. Thomas's smile lingered just a bit longer than necessary, his gaze just a bit too focused. He complimented her work and she couldn't help but feel flattered. But that evening would not be the last time their paths crossed. Their encounters continued in secret, first at small gatherings, then at more intimate meetings away from the public eye. Neither of them could explain exactly when things shifted, but over time, their connection deepened. Sarah was drawn to Miller's ambition, the way he could command a room, the way he made her feel like she was the only one who mattered in a crowded space. For his part, Miller was captivated by Sarah's independence, her intellect, and her willingness to challenge everything he stood for. The chemistry between them was undeniable, and before long, what started as a professional relationship took a dangerous turn. They began seeing each other in private, their meetings becoming more frequent, their exchanges more intimate. But there was one problem. Sarah knew too much. As the months passed, her investigative work brought her closer and closer to the heart of something dangerous. Something that could bring down the man she was becoming so deeply involved with. She had uncovered connections between Miller and several corrupt businessmen, each with ties to shady dealings that could shatter the political landscape. The story of her career was unfolding, but with every passing day, it was becoming harder to separate her feelings for Miller from the journalist she had always prided herself on being. In the back of her mind, she knew the affair could destroy her career. But the thrill of their secret kept her locked in a dangerous dance. Sarah found herself standing at a crossroads, caught between the truth she was so determined to expose and the man who had wrapped her in a web of charm and deception. Neither could see the danger looming ahead, and both were about to pay a devastating price for their secrets. As Sarah continued her investigation into the dealings of Thomas Miller, the pressure started to build. Every piece of information she uncovered felt like a damning confirmation that her suspicions were right, that the man she had come to care for was in fact entangled in a web of corruption that extended far beyond what she could have imagined. But the deeper she dug, the more conflicted she became. Her feelings for Miller were growing stronger, and the line between the politician she once admired and the man she had fallen for was beginning to blur. Miller had always been careful, maintaining a delicate balance between his public persona and his private life. But as Sarah's investigation began to hit too close to home, cracks started to appear in his facade. He became more agitated, more paranoid. Meetings that once felt like moments of escape now carried an underlying tension. Whenever they were together, there was a sense of unease. Miller's eyes darting around nervously, his words more hesitant than before, as if he feared someone might be watching or listening. His need for secrecy had always been there, but now it seemed more desperate, more urgent. It wasn't long before Sarah began receiving anonymous threats. Cryptic messages warning her to stop digging, to let go of the story before it was too late. At first, they were subtle, but they soon escalated into outright intimidation. One evening, as Sarah was heading home, a man approached her in a dark alley, telling her in a cold, almost casual tone, "Leave Miller alone. He's not the man you think he is. This won't end well for you." She was shaken, but the fear only fueled her determination. She had seen too much, uncovered too much, to back down now. Miller, unaware of the full extent of the threat Sarah was facing, continued to keep his distance, though his behavior grew more erratic. His phone calls to her became more frequent, filled with subtle pleas to drop the investigation. "You don't know what you're getting yourself into," he would say, his voice strained. But Sarah could sense the underlying fear. "There are forces at play here that neither of us can control. You need to stop." But despite his warnings, Sarah knew that she had come too far to turn back. She had a duty to expose the truth, no matter the cost. One evening, as Sarah was finalizing her report on Miller's connections to a powerful group of businessmen, she received a call from an anonymous source. Someone who claimed to have more information, more damning evidence that would finish the story once and for all. The caller was vague, but the message was clear. Sarah was getting too close, and there were people who would stop at nothing to keep the truth hidden. The threat was now more real than ever, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that Miller was somehow involved. There were too many inconsistencies, too many unanswered questions. Despite the growing danger, Sarah was determined to see the investigation through to the end. She would publish the story. She had to. But even as Sarah prepared to release the explosive report, she began to wonder if Miller knew the truth about her investigation, and if so, how far he was willing to go to protect his secrets. The deeper she sank into this dangerous game, the more she realized that she was not just dealing with a corrupt politician. Miller was tied to something far darker, something much more sinister than she could have ever anticipated. The stakes were higher than she could have imagined, and the cost of exposing the truth might be more than she was willing to pay. In the midst of all this, Sarah received one final message from Miller, this time more urgent than ever. "Please, Sarah," it read. "I'll lose everything if you do this. You don't understand the danger you're in." It was the first time she had heard him so vulnerable, so desperate. But for Sarah, the message only confirmed what she had suspected for so long. She was on the brink of uncovering something that would change everything, but at what cost? Could she expose the truth without destroying herself in the process? As the pressure mounted, Sarah's resolve remained unshaken, even as the shadow of danger grew larger. What she didn't know was that Miller's desperation had already driven him to make a choice, one that would set the course for everything that was to come. The night Sarah agreed to meet Thomas Miller at the secluded cabin was unlike any other. She had known that she was walking into a situation fraught with uncertainty, but her determination to expose the truth had made her blind to the real danger that awaited her. Miller had insisted that the cabin was the only place where they could talk without fear of eavesdropping, but Sarah had a nagging feeling that there was more to his invitation than just the need for privacy. Despite the unease creeping into her thoughts, she pressed on, thinking that this would be the meeting that would reveal everything, once and for all. When Sarah arrived, the quiet isolation of the cabin struck her immediately. It was nestled deep in the woods, far from the watchful eyes of the city, and the only sounds she could hear were the rustling of leaves in the wind and the distant chirp of crickets. The air was cool, and the shadows cast by the trees seemed to stretch endlessly. The perfect place to hide, she thought. A place where secrets could be kept hidden. Miller was waiting for her, standing on the porch, his expression a mix of relief and apprehension. He seemed different tonight. His usual poise was gone, replaced by something raw, something desperate. Sarah had seen him in control, charismatic and calculating, but tonight, he seemed like a man on the edge of breaking. As she stepped closer, he greeted her with a tense smile, but there was an unease in his eyes that she couldn't ignore. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere felt thick with unspoken tension. The wooden floors creaked beneath their feet as they moved to the small living room, where the only light came from a flickering fire in the stone fireplace. The warmth of the room did little to ease the cold weight of the conversation that was about to unfold. Sarah had prepared herself for a confrontation, but nothing could have prepared her for the gravity of what Miller was about to reveal. He started speaking, but it wasn't the usual polished rhetoric Sarah was accustomed to. Instead, his words came out in hurried, disjointed sentences, as if he was struggling to organize his thoughts. He told her about the people who had been threatening him, powerful figures in the criminal underworld who had been pulling the strings behind the scenes. He described the web of corruption that tied them all together, a network of money, power, and influence that extended far beyond the political arena. These were not just businessmen with shady dealings. They were dangerous men who operated in the shadows, men who didn't care who they hurt to get what they wanted. Miller's tone shifted as he spoke about the consequences of exposing them. It wasn't just his career on the line. His life was in jeopardy. Sarah could see the fear in his eyes now, something she had never seen before. It was the fear of a man who knew that he had already gone too far. A man who understood that there was no turning back. But what Miller didn't realize was that his revelations only deepened Sarah's suspicions. She had always suspected that he was hiding something, but the truth was far darker than she had imagined. The people he was connected to weren't just corrupt politicians or businessmen. They were part of a criminal empire that extended into every corner of the city. And Miller, despite his charm and his public image, was an integral part of that system. As Sarah processed this new information, she felt a rush of conflicting emotions. Part of her wanted to turn away, to walk out of that cabin and forget everything she had learned. But the journalist in her refused to let go of the story. She knew that she was standing on the precipice of something that could shake the foundations of the city itself. But as much as she wanted to expose the truth, she also couldn't ignore the sense of danger that now hung in the air. The stakes had escalated, and the world she was about to step into was far more perilous than she had ever anticipated. As Miller continued to plead with her to abandon the investigation, his desperation became palpable. He spoke of his family, his career, and the life he had built, how it all would come crashing down if Sarah published the story. But in his words, Sarah could hear the underlying truth. It wasn't just about saving himself. He was trying to protect something much larger than that, something he feared would come after him and her if the story saw the light of day. The realization hit Sarah like a wave. She was no longer just dealing with a corrupt politician. She was tangled in a web that extended far beyond her understanding. Miller was no longer the man she had once believed in. The man who had seduced her with his charm and ambition was now a prisoner of the very system he had created. The question was no longer whether to publish the story, it was whether she would survive long enough to tell it. As the night wore on, the tension between them only grew. Sarah felt trapped in the crossfire between truth and survival. She could feel the walls closing in around her, and for the first time, the fear that Miller had been trying to warn her about felt real. The game had changed, and there was no going back. The following morning, Sarah's absence was immediately noticed. She had missed a scheduled interview with her colleague, a fellow reporter who had been helping her gather information on Miller's connections. Her phone went unanswered, and by noon, people started to worry. Her friends, colleagues, and family all knew Sarah to be punctual and reliable. She wouldn't just disappear without a word. As the day dragged on and there was still no sign of her, concern began to grow into suspicion. By the time the police were called, Sarah's disappearance had turned into a full-blown investigation. Her apartment was searched, but there was no sign of a struggle. Her belongings were undisturbed and there were no signs of forced entry. Everything appeared normal. Too normal. Sarah had left nothing behind that indicated a sudden, hasty departure. Yet, despite this calm exterior, something was terribly wrong. Her colleagues quickly realized that Sarah had been on the brink of publishing the story that could bring down Miller, and now she was gone. As the investigation into her disappearance deepened, the trail led to the cabin where she had last met with Miller. The remote location, far from the city's eyes, seemed like the perfect place for a clandestine conversation. But it also made it an ideal spot to hide a crime. The police scoured the area, but found no immediate signs of foul play, no fingerprints or other clues that would immediately tie Miller to her disappearance. The cabin was quiet, untouched, as if Sarah had simply walked out and never returned. But as the investigation progressed, the gaps in the evidence began to form a chilling picture. There were whispers, rumors from sources who had seen Miller acting strangely in the days leading up to Sarah's disappearance. His nervous behavior at public events, the increasing urgency in his private meetings, and his cryptic statements to Sarah during their last conversation all pointed to something more sinister than just an affair gone wrong. It wasn't long before Sarah's body was found, discarded in a remote area just outside the city limits. The discovery sent shockwaves through the community. Her death was a brutal one, and the location where she had been left showed a deliberate attempt to hide the body. The police were quick to recognize that this wasn't a random act of violence or a robbery gone wrong. This was personal, and it was tied to the secrets Sarah had been so determined to uncover. The investigation turned toward Miller. As a public figure, he was under intense scrutiny, but there was still no direct evidence linking him to the crime. He remained calm, cool, and collected when questioned by the authorities, but there was something unsettling about the way he handled the situation. He expressed sadness at her death, but also seemed to distance himself from any responsibility. It was as if he was playing a game, keeping his cards close to his chest. The deeper the police delved into Miller's life, the more they uncovered his ties to powerful individuals. Men who could make anyone disappear without a trace, men who had no regard for the law. Sarah had been digging into their dealings, and now it seemed that she had uncovered something far bigger than even she had realized. But even with this growing body of evidence pointing to Miller's involvement, there was no smoking gun. No one could directly prove that he had orchestrated her murder. In the weeks following Sarah's death, the media frenzy escalated. Miller's reputation, once untouchable, began to tarnish. The story of Sarah's murder became a media spectacle, with every new detail fueling the fire. But despite the mounting public pressure, Miller remained composed, almost eerily calm. It was clear that someone was pulling the strings behind the scenes, ensuring that he would not go down without a fight. Meanwhile, Sarah's colleagues refused to let the story die. Her close friend, a fellow journalist, who had been helping Sarah with her investigation, continued to dig into the evidence Sarah had left behind. The colleague was determined to finish the story Sarah had started, to bring to light the truth that had cost her life. Little by little, they uncovered more pieces of the puzzle, each one connecting Miller to a far-reaching network of criminal activity. The corruption went beyond Miller. It involved the very people who controlled the city, the ones who had always been above the law. As the investigation gained momentum, Miller's fear began to show. The polished facade he had so carefully crafted was starting to crumble. He was no longer the charming, untouchable politician who could talk his way out of anything. Now he was a man on the run, haunted by the very people he had betrayed. The authorities were closing in, and every new piece of evidence pointed in his direction. Yet despite all the clues, the case was far from solved. The authorities were running out of time, and with each passing day, the chances of catching Miller grew slimmer. The real question now was whether the truth would ever come to light, or if the forces behind Miller's empire would continue to keep the truth buried, just as they had done with Sarah's life. Months passed, and the investigation into Sarah's murder seemed to stall. despite the mounting evidence against Thomas Miller. The public outcry reached a fever pitch, but with each new piece of information, the questions only multiplied. The deeper they dug, the more tangled the web of corruption became. Miller's connections to powerful figures in the city's criminal underworld had become too vast to untangle in a short time. He was no longer just a politician in the spotlight. He was a man with vast resources at his disposal, able to manipulate the legal system and steer the investigation away from him. Sarah's former colleagues, particularly the journalist who had worked closest with her, refused to let the case fade into the background. They continued to pursue every lead, interviewing sources who had previously remained silent. It was a dangerous game, but they knew that the only way to honor Sarah's memory was to expose the truth. The deeper they dug, the more they uncovered about Miller's ties to illicit deals and shady figures. His political rise had been built on a foundation of lies, bribes, and ruthless manipulation. His charm had only served to mask the darkness beneath the surface. The breakthrough came when Sarah's colleague found a series of encrypted documents on her computer, hidden deep within her files. The documents contained financial records and correspondences between Miller and a network of businessmen with ties to organized crime. The evidence was irrefutable. Sarah had been on the verge of exposing a conspiracy so vast that it threatened to take down some of the most powerful people in the city. As the colleague worked to decode the final pieces, it became clear Miller wasn't just guilty of corruption. He was the architect of a criminal empire that stretched far beyond the city's borders. With this new evidence in hand, the authorities finally had enough to make their move. A warrant was issued for Miller's arrest, but by then it was too late. Miller had vanished, leaving behind nothing but a trail of destruction. Some believed he had fled the country, while others suspected that he had gone into hiding, protected by the very people he had once served. The case against Miller remained open, but without a body or his immediate capture, justice seemed elusive. Sarah's murder, once thought to be a crime of passion, had become a symbol of the corruption that had long plagued the city. Her sacrifice had not been in vain. The truth was finally beginning to surface, and the forces that had tried to silence her were slowly but surely being exposed. Yet the story was far from over. There would be no easy resolution, no neat conclusion. The fight for justice continued, and with it the memory of Sarah Kent, courageous and unrelenting in her pursuit of the truth. Despite Sarah's tragic end, her legacy endured, becoming the catalyst for change in a city long dominated by corruption and power. The investigation into her murder remained unsolved, but the revelations she had uncovered about Miller and the criminal network he was involved in could not be buried. The city, shaken by her death, began to demand accountability in ways it never had before. The more her story was told, the more people realized the depth of the corruption that had festered for years. The documents Sarah had uncovered, though not enough to secure Miller's immediate capture, were used by other journalists and investigators to build an airtight case against him. They traced his connections to organized crime, money laundering schemes, and illegal political deals, implicating numerous individuals who had once been untouchable. Whispers in the streets turned into loud calls for justice, and the public's demand for answers became impossible to ignore. While Miller remained elusive, his empire was starting to crumble. But it wasn't just the public that felt the weight of Sarah's findings. It was the entire system. Law enforcement agencies, pressured by public outcry and growing political pressure, took extraordinary measures to track him down. The longer he remained in hiding, the more desperate he became. Eventually, his downfall came not from law enforcement, but from the very people he had betrayed. Former allies turned against him, their loyalty having worn thin as the stakes grew higher. They knew the only way to save themselves was to testify against him, offering crucial information that helped authorities close in on his location. The arrest of Thomas Miller sent shockwaves throughout the city. His once revered status was shattered, and the politicians and businessmen who had supported him found themselves implicated in a sprawling scandal that reached every corner of the community. As Miller was hauled into court facing charges of murder, corruption, and conspiracy, his calm, controlled persona cracked. His empire had collapsed, and the weight of his actions finally caught up to him. While Miller's arrest marked a partial victory, it couldn't erase the pain and loss that Sarah's friends and family had endured. The justice they sought for her was far from perfect, and the void she left behind could never be filled. But Sarah's courage, her relentless pursuit of the truth, had changed the course of the city's future. Her death became the rallying cry for those who had been silenced for too long, the wake-up call that inspired a new wave of accountability in politics and journalism.